A queen can command an empire, but sometimes a single scar tells a deeper story. The throne chamber of the Seraphine Citadel was colder than the vacuum outside its crystal walls, the polished black floor reflecting the towering figure of Queen Seraphina Kale as she descended the steps of her throne with slow, deliberate grace. The chamber stretched nearly 200 feet across, its vaulted ceiling glowing with soft starlight from the nebula beyond the transparent dome. Yet the attention of every alien noble, officer, and guard in the hall had narrowed to a single human kneeling at the center of the floor. Marcus Cole kept his head slightly lowered, chains resting loosely against his wrists, the metal cool against skin that had seen harsher environments than this palace ever could. At 6 feet 2 inches tall, he was broader than most of the beings surrounding him, his worn gray jacket removed by the guards and tossed aside somewhere near the entrance, leaving only a dark undershirt stretched across a chest marked by old, pale lines. The guards had expected fear when they forced him to kneel, but Marcus simply breathed slowly, steady and quiet, as if the weight of a royal court staring him down was just another long day on a frontier outpost. Seraphina stopped a few steps away from him, the faint shimmer of her deep blue skin catching the light like polished sapphire, golden eyes studying the human with the careful curiosity of someone used to seeing lies disguised as loyalty. She had been told the prisoner was dangerous, a human mercenary who had crossed 3 systems and somehow ended up at the gates of her capital with half the border patrol convinced he was either a spy or a madman. Yet what she saw now did not look like madness. Her gaze moved across the marks along his arms, the faint white ridge of an old burn near his collarbone, another thin scar that traced along his shoulder like a quiet memory carved into skin. These were not fresh injuries. They were stories written years ago, the kind of marks soldiers carried long after the wars were forgotten. Around the chamber, the court murmured softly, alien voices layered with suspicion, but Seraphina raised one slender hand, and the sound faded instantly. Silence returned like a held breath. She stepped closer. Marcus finally lifted his eyes. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Outside the dome, a slow drift of distant starlight painted the chamber in shifting silver. The queen's voice came calm and thoughtful, almost gentle. "You have the scars of a fighter." Marcus gave the smallest shrug. "Occupational hazard." A faint ripple of surprise moved through the watching officers at the casual tone. Seraphina studied him another moment, something thoughtful moving behind her golden eyes. "Those wounds are not the kind earned by someone hiding in shadows," she said quietly. "They are the kind earned protecting someone." Marcus did not answer right away. The air hummed softly with distant power systems running through the palace walls. Finally he spoke, voice low but steady. "Yeah," he said. Seraphina tilted her head slightly, curiosity sharpening her gaze. "Then tell me." "Human," she said, taking one final step closer so the light caught the faint lines across his chest. "Who were you fighting for?" Marcus looked directly at her now, calm, almost amused despite the chains resting around his wrists. For the first time since entering the chamber, a faint smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. Marcus held the queen's gaze for several seconds before answering, and the silence that filled the chamber felt heavier than the chains resting loosely against his wrists. The nobles lining the outer ring of the throne hall shifted slightly, their robes whispering against polished stone as curiosity spread through the crowd. Humans were still new to most of them, strange pink-skinned creatures from a distant world that had only joined the wider galactic community a few decades earlier. Yet the man kneeling in the center of the hall did not appear intimidated by the attention. Marcus Cole breathed slowly, shoulders relaxed, as though he were standing in the quiet of a desert instead of beneath the eyes of an alien empire. Queen Seraphina studied him with growing fascination. In her long life, she had seen diplomats, traders, soldiers, and spies from many species, but rarely had she seen someone stand so calmly inside uncertainty. There was no desperation in his posture and no attempt to impress the court. Only patience. Finally Marcus answered, his voice calm and measured. "I fought because it was the right thing to do." A few officers near the edge of the chamber exchanged skeptical looks, and one of the armored commanders stepped forward. "Slightly, Your Majesty, the human is avoiding the question. His arrival at the capital was irregular, and the Border Patrol reports that he traveled alone across 3 systems." That alone is reason for suspicion. Serafina did not take her eyes off Marcus. Perhaps, she said quietly, but suspicion is not proof. The commander bowed his head and stepped back, though his posture still carried the rigid concern of someone who believed the human should already be in a holding cell instead of a royal audience. Marcus noticed the exchange and gave the faintest exhale of amusement. Palace politics, he said softly. Every government looks the same once you travel far enough. A few quiet murmurs moved through the chamber at the casual remark. Serafina raised one brow slightly. You speak as if you have traveled often. Marcus nodded once. Long enough to learn that most people in power worry about the wrong things. The queen folded her hands behind her back as she slowly circled him, her long silver hair catching the starlight from the great dome overhead. From this angle, she could see more of the marks across his shoulders, the subtle stiffness in the way he held his right arm, the posture of someone who had spent years carrying equipment and responsibility across harsh environments. These were not the movements of a criminal. They were the habits of someone who had endured long roads and longer nights. When she stopped in front of him again, her voice was quieter, more thoughtful. You crossed several sectors alone to reach this world. Few travelers attempt that route without a fleet escort. Marcus shrugged slightly. Ships break down. Maps get old. And sometimes the fastest route is the one nobody else wants to take. Serafina studied him for another moment before asking the question that had been forming in her mind since she first saw those scars. If you came all this way willingly, then you must have had a destination in mind. Marcus looked up at the great glass dome where distant stars drifted slowly past the palace skyline. Yeah, he said after a moment. I did. The queen followed his gaze briefly before returning her attention to him. And that destination was here. Marcus nodded once. Yes, Your Majesty. A faint ripple of surprise moved through the court again. Serafina tilted her head slightly, curiosity deepening. You came to my capital without an invitation, without allies, and without a clear explanation. That is an unusual decision, even for a human. Marcus met her eyes again, the faint smile returning at the corner of his mouth. Maybe, but sometimes the long way around is the only way to find the person you are looking for. The words hung in the vast throne chamber like a quiet ripple across still water, and for a moment even the distant hum of the citadel's power systems seemed to fade. Queen Serafina Kale studied the human kneeling before her with renewed focus, the golden glow of her eyes reflecting faintly against the polished floor. Around them the royal court remained perfectly still, every noble and officer waiting to hear what strange explanation the human would offer next. Marcus Cole did not rush to fill the silence. He simply looked up at the transparent dome overhead where the slow drift of distant stars marked the passage of time far beyond the walls of the palace. The quiet confidence in his posture unsettled several members of the court. Visitors usually arrived with rehearsed speeches or desperate pleas for favor. This human carried neither. Serafina took a slow step closer, the faint sound of her boots echoing across the chamber's wide marble floor. You claim that you traveled across several sectors searching for someone, she said calmly. That is a remarkable journey for a single traveler. Marcus shrugged slightly, the chains shifting with a soft metallic sound. It is not the longest trip I have taken. One of the alien advisors near the throne whispered something under his breath, and another responded with a skeptical shake of his head. Serafina ignored them. Her attention remained fixed on Marcus as she considered the quiet certainty in his voice. Most beings who stood before a royal court tried to make themselves appear important. This human seemed almost amused by the entire situation. You speak as if this destination was inevitable, she continued. Marcus tilted his head slightly. Sometimes the road points you somewhere whether you plan it or not. The queen folded her arms loosely as she studied him. The faint lines across his shoulders were easier to see now beneath the pale light of the star dome, and they confirmed the impression forming in her mind. This was a man who had walked through difficult places without turning back. That alone made him unusual among visitors to the capital. If you came looking for someone, she said slowly, then perhaps you should explain why you chose to arrive through a restricted defense corridor instead of requesting an audience through proper diplomatic channels. A quiet ripple of agreement moved through the officers standing along the chamber walls. Marcus gave a small smile. Because if I sent a message ahead of time, I would have been turned away. Several members of the court shifted uncomfortably at the blunt honesty. Serafina raised one eyebrow. That suggests you expected resistance. Marcus nodded once. I did. The queen took another step forward until she stood only a few feet from him. From this distance, she could see the faint tiredness around his eyes, the look of someone who had not slept properly in several days. Traveling alone through frontier space was not easy for any species. Yet he had reached the center of her empire without escort or assistance. That required determination and perhaps a measure of recklessness. Both traits interested her more than she expected. Your explanation is incomplete, she said. You still have not told us who you came to find. Marcus slowly lowered his gaze from the stars and met her eyes again. For a brief moment the chamber felt smaller, as if the entire court had drawn closer to hear his answer. I was looking for the woman who changed my life, he said quietly. A faint murmur moved through the nobles. Serafina did not react outwardly, but something thoughtful flickered behind her golden eyes. That is a bold claim to make in front of an imperial court, she replied. Marcus exhaled slowly, the faint smile returning again. Maybe, but it is still true. The queen studied him for another long moment before asking the question that now seemed unavoidable. And where did you meet this mysterious woman? Marcus lifted his chin slightly, his voice steady and clear. About 5 years ago, on a frontier station near the edge of your territory. Serafina felt a faint stirring of memory she could not yet place, like a distant echo just beyond reach. Marcus continued quietly. Back when you were not wearing a crown. The quiet words settled over the throne chamber like a slow-moving shadow, and for the first time since the human had been brought before the court, Queen Serafina Kale did not immediately respond. 5 years ago, a frontier station near the edge of her territory. The memory brushed against the edge of her thoughts like a faint signal trying to break through static. Around them the nobles began murmuring again, confused and uneasy. Few people in the empire had ever known the queen before her coronation, and even fewer would dare suggest such familiarity in front of the entire court. Yet the human kneeling before her did not sound like someone guessing. He sounded certain. Serafina narrowed her golden eyes slightly as she studied his face again, this time not as a ruler judging a stranger, but as someone searching through distant memories. Marcus Cole remained calm beneath the attention, shoulders relaxed, gaze steady. He did not rush to explain further. The patience in his silence only deepened the tension in the chamber. One of the senior officers finally stepped forward again, his armor catching the soft light from the star dome. Your Majesty, the human is clearly attempting to fabricate a story to gain favor. The implication that he knew you before your coronation is highly unlikely. Serafina raised her hand, and the officer fell silent at once. She continued looking at Marcus. 5 years ago, she repeated slowly. That would have been before the transition of the throne. Marcus nodded once. Back when the empire was still ruled by your father. A faint stir moved through the court at the mention of the former emperor. Serafina's expression remained composed, but the memory in her mind sharpened slightly. During that time she had traveled beyond the capital more than once, often quietly, without the full weight of royal escort. It had been her way of understanding the outer territories of the empire before she would someday rule them. Frontier stations, trade routes, distant colonies. Those journeys had shown her a version of the empire that rarely reached the palace. She looked at Marcus again, noticing something she had overlooked before. The faint dusting of gray at his temples suggested experience beyond his years. The lines around his eyes were not just from age, but from long hours spent under bright suns and colder stars. If they had crossed paths before, it would not have been in a place like this. It would have been somewhere rougher, somewhere forgotten by the royal court. Where exactly was this station? She asked quietly. Marcus shifted slightly, the chains giving a soft metallic sound against the marble floor. A refueling hub on the outer trade corridor. 200 light years past the Kareth belt. The place was called Horizon Gate. The name landed in Serafina's memory like a key turning in an old lock. For a brief moment the throne chamber faded around her as a distant image surfaced from the past. A small docking port orbiting a quiet blue star. Cargo ships drifting slowly through the station's narrow traffic lanes. Merchants from a dozen species arguing over freight schedules and fuel contracts. She had visited that station once during a diplomatic tour, traveling under a false identity to observe the trade networks firsthand. Very few people had known who she really was. The memory sharpened further. A crowded market corridor. The smell of recycled air and engine coolant. And somewhere in that crowded station, there had been a human. She looked back at Marcus more carefully now. The faint scar along his shoulder suddenly seemed familiar in a way she could not yet fully explain. "You were suggesting that we met on Horizon Gate," she said slowly. Marcus gave a quiet nod. "Yes, Your Majesty." Serafina searched his face again, trying to place the memory more clearly. 5 years was a long time in the life of an empire. Yet the certainty in his voice carried a strange weight. "If you were truly there," she said, "then you must know that I was not the queen at that time." Marcus's faint smile returned. "I know." The chamber waited in silence as he continued calmly. "Back then you were just another traveler trying not to attract attention." The throne chamber remained silent long after Marcus finished speaking, and Queen Serafina Kale slowly turned her gaze away from him toward the vast star-filled dome above the palace. Horizon Gate. The name echoed through her memory with increasing clarity now, pulling loose details from the past like distant lights emerging from fog. 5 years earlier, she had traveled through that station under a false identity, accompanied by only 2 quiet guards who remained hidden most of the time. Her father had believed that an heir should understand the empire beyond palace walls, and those journeys had shown her places where royal influence felt very far away. Horizon Gate had been one of the rougher stations along the outer trade corridor, a place where cargo freighters, miners, and independent pilots gathered to refuel before long crossings through unsettled sectors. The markets there had been crowded and loud, filled with voices from dozens of species negotiating over shipments, repairs, and navigation charts. Serafina remembered walking through those corridors wearing a simple traveler's cloak, careful to avoid attention while observing how the frontier truly lived. Slowly she lowered her eyes back to the human kneeling before her. Marcus Cole watched her calmly, as if he knew the memory was beginning to surface. Around them the royal court shifted uneasily. The officers and advisors standing along the chamber walls had never heard the queen speak openly about those journeys before her coronation. The silence stretched until Serafina finally spoke again. "If you were there," she said slowly, "then you must have noticed something unusual about that station." Marcus nodded once. The power grid had been failing that week. The main docking ring lost lighting for almost an hour. A faint ripple of surprise moved through the court. The detail was too specific to invent easily. Serafina's eyes narrowed slightly as another memory slid into place. The lights had indeed failed during her visit, forcing many of the merchants and travelers to gather inside the central market concourse while engineers restored the system. She remembered standing near one of the open windows that overlooked the docking lanes, watching a small convoy of cargo ships drift slowly past the station's outer ring. The moment had been quiet compared to the noise of the market behind her, and somewhere in that memory there had been a human voice speaking nearby. Marcus shifted his weight slightly and continued, his tone steady. "You were standing by the observation rail overlooking Dock 12. You had been asking a mechanic how often the outer trade routes were patrolled." Serafina felt the memory snap into sharp focus. Dock 12. The mechanic had been a tall reptilian engineer explaining how the patrols were often delayed by the distance between stations. She had been listening carefully because the answer had revealed weaknesses in the Empire's frontier security. Slowly her gaze returned to Marcus. The court had fallen completely silent now. The human met her eyes without hesitation. "You were not wearing royal colors," he said calmly. "Just a dark blue travel cloak. But you were asking questions that only someone important would ask." Serafina felt a strange mixture of recognition and disbelief begin to form. Very few people on that station had spoken with her directly during that visit. Most travelers had simply passed by without noticing her at all. Yet the human kneeling before her seemed to remember the moment clearly. And there was one more detail stirring at the edge of her memory. A conversation near the observation rail. A human voice offering an opinion about the frontier routes. She studied Marcus more closely now, noticing the quiet confidence in the way he held himself. 5 years earlier the man would have been younger, perhaps standing somewhere in that crowded market corridor with the same steady gaze. The queen spoke again, her voice quieter now but filled with curiosity. "If we met on Horizon Gate, then tell me something only that man would know." Marcus's faint smile returned as he looked up at her. You asked the mechanic why the patrol ships did not travel in pairs. And when he told you it would cost too much fuel, you said that security should never depend on convenience. The final sentence settled across the throne chamber like a quiet echo, and Queen Seraphina Kale felt the memory complete itself with startling clarity. She remembered saying those exact words beside the observation rail at Horizon Gate. Security should never depend on convenience. At the time, it had been nothing more than a passing comment during a conversation with a mechanic, spoken by a traveler who was trying to understand how the frontier truly worked. Yet hearing the human repeat it now, 5 years later, sent a subtle ripple through her thoughts. The court remained perfectly still as Seraphina slowly studied Marcus Cole again. There was no hesitation in his expression and no sign that he was trying to impress her. He had simply answered the challenge she had given him. One of the advisors near the throne leaned toward another and whispered something quietly, clearly unsettled by the direction the conversation was taking. Few people alive could quote the private remarks of the queen from before her coronation, and fewer still would dare to repeat them in front of the entire imperial court. Seraphina finally exhaled slowly, the faint tension leaving her shoulders. It appears you were listening more carefully than I realized, she said. Marcus gave a small shrug. Hard not to notice someone asking smart questions on a station where most people are just arguing about cargo prices. A faint murmur moved through the chamber at the human's blunt tone, but Seraphina did not reprimand him. Instead, she looked down at the faint lines across his arms again, the old marks that had first drawn her attention when he entered the hall. 5 years ago, the man standing near that observation rail had not looked much different, though perhaps younger and without a few of the newer scars she could see now. She remembered another detail from that day as well. After her conversation with the mechanic had ended, the human standing nearby had offered a quiet observation about the frontier trade lanes. Something practical, something thoughtful. You spoke to me that day, she said slowly, testing the memory aloud. Marcus nodded once. Only for a minute. You asked why a human pilot was traveling alone that far from Earth space. Seraphina felt the final piece of the memory fall into place. Yes. The human had answered with an explanation about independent freight contracts and the long distances between safe ports. The conversation had been brief, but strangely memorable. Most travelers had been cautious around her even without knowing who she was. This one had simply spoken honestly. You told me that the frontier changes people, she said quietly. Marcus smiled faintly. It does. Out there nobody cares where you come from. Only whether you can keep your ship running and help the next person when things go wrong. The queen considered that answer for a moment. It sounded exactly like the kind of philosophy a frontier pilot would develop after years of long journeys between distant stations. Around them the court was no longer murmuring. The nobles had begun listening with genuine interest now, sensing that the strange meeting between their queen and the human might hold more history than anyone expected. Seraphina finally asked the question that had been quietly forming since the memory returned. If we spoke only briefly on that station, then why would you travel across several sectors years later just to find me again? Marcus looked up at the star-filled dome above them, the distant lights reflecting faintly in his eyes. Because that conversation did not end the way you think it did. The queen tilted her head slightly, curiosity returning to her expression. What do you mean? Marcus lowered his gaze back to her, calm and certain. After we talked, something happened on that station that changed both of our paths. The throne chamber held its breath after Marcus finished speaking, and the quiet hum of the Citadel's power systems seemed louder than before. Queen Seraphina Kale watched the human carefully, the reflection of distant stars shimmering across her blue skin as she considered his words. Something happened on that station that changed both of our paths. The statement carried a weight that even the nobles around the chamber could feel. Marcus remained kneeling, calm and patient, as if he understood that the memory he was about to uncover would take time to surface completely. Seraphina folded her arms slowly, her golden eyes narrowing in thought as the past continued to unfold in her mind. Horizon Gate had been crowded that day, filled with merchants arguing over freight schedules and engineers repairing aging systems. She had spoken with dozens of people during that visit, most of them briefly. Yet there had been a moment later that evening that felt different from the rest of the day. The station's artificial lights had dimmed again during another fluctuation in the power grid, leaving parts of the market corridor illuminated only by the glow of docking beacons outside the viewing windows. She remembered walking through the quieter section of the station near Dock 12 after most of the merchants had closed their stalls. The traffic lanes beyond the glass had been filled with slow-moving cargo ships drifting toward their assigned berths. It had been peaceful in a way that frontier stations rarely were. Serafina focused on Marcus again. "Continue," she said quietly. Marcus nodded once, his voice steady as he began to recount the moment. "After we talked near the observation rail, you left the market corridor. I noticed you were heading toward the outer docking ring instead of the passenger transit elevators. That was unusual for a traveler." Serafina felt the memory sharpen further. She had been planning to inspect the station's cargo operations more closely before returning to her ship. Only a handful of her escort knew about the detour. Marcus continued calmly. "I had just finished a supply run for a transport crew that was delayed in Dock 12. When I saw you walking toward the outer ring alone, I figured you were either very confident or very unfamiliar with frontier stations." A few quiet smiles appeared among the nobles listening to the story. Serafina allowed herself the faintest hint of amusement. At the time, she had believed her disguise would prevent anyone from recognizing her status. It had not occurred to her that a simple traveler might question her decision to wander alone through the less populated sections of the station. Marcus glanced briefly toward the great dome above them before continuing. The outer ring was nearly empty when the lights dimmed again. The backup systems kicked in, but the corridor was still darker than the rest of the station. "I remember seeing you stop near one of the cargo access doors. You were looking at the docking lanes like you were trying to memorize how everything worked." The Queen nodded slowly. "Yes," she said. "I wanted to understand how the trade corridor moved freight through the system." Marcus's faint smile returned. "That is when the station's traffic alarm started sounding. A minor navigation issue between two incoming freighters forced the port authority to halt departures for a while. It was not dangerous, but it caused a lot of confusion on the outer ring." Serafina felt her memory finally align with the human's words. The alarm had drawn several travelers toward the viewing windows to watch the docking procedure. She had stepped closer to the glass for a better view. Marcus leaned forward slightly as he finished the thought. "And that was the moment you almost walked straight into the one thing nobody on that station expected to see." Marcus's voice remained steady as the memory unfolded, and the court leaned forward almost unconsciously to hear what came next. Queen Serafina Kale felt the final pieces of the past rising into focus, the faint sensation of recognition sharpening behind her golden eyes. The human watched her carefully, as though he could see the moment the memory finally returned. 5 years earlier, the outer docking ring of Horizon Gate had been dimly lit after the station's backup systems activated. The corridor had smelled faintly of engine coolant and recycled air, and the great windows along the hull had revealed the quiet ballet of cargo ships drifting slowly through the traffic lanes beyond the station. Serafina remembered standing there in her travel cloak, studying the pattern of freighters moving through Dock 12 while the station alarm echoed softly through the structure. It had not been a dangerous situation, only a navigation delay while two large freighters coordinated their approach vectors, but the commotion had drawn attention to the viewing corridor. Several travelers had gathered near the glass to watch the maneuver unfold. Marcus continued speaking calmly. "When the alarm sounded, most people moved closer to the windows to see what was happening. But you were focused on something else." Serafina's memory answered before she spoke. "The cargo manifest screens." She had been examining the large digital boards that displayed the flow of shipments moving through the station. Her interest had been purely practical. The Empire relied heavily on the efficiency of frontier trade routes, and Horizon Gate had been one of the busiest transfer points along that corridor. Marcus nodded, as if confirming her thought. "You were reading the shipping routes on the display panel beside Dock 12. Most travelers ignored those screens because they looked complicated, but you studied them like someone trying to understand the entire system." A faint ripple of recognition passed through the Queen's expression. Yes. She had spent nearly 10 minutes studying the routes while the station technicians worked to restore normal traffic flow. It had been a quiet moment of observation, the kind that had shaped her understanding of the Empire long before she wore a crown. Marcus leaned slightly forward as he continued. "While you were reading those manifests, the corridor door behind you opened, and a cargo inspection team entered the docking ring. They were moving quickly because the traffic delay had caused several shipments to arrive out of order. Serafina felt another detail fall into place. The inspectors had been wearing bright orange utility jackets and carrying portable scanners as they moved along the docking ring. Their presence had not seemed unusual at the time. Yet Marcus's voice carried a different emphasis now. Most people stepped aside when they saw the inspection team coming through the corridor. You did not notice them at first because you were focused on the shipping data. Serafina remembered the moment clearly now. She had turned toward the corridor only after hearing the sound of equipment carts rolling across the metal floor. Marcus's faint smile returned. That was when you realized something strange. The scanners those inspectors were carrying were not pointed at the cargo containers. They were pointed at the travelers standing near the windows. The Queen's eyes widened slightly as the realization returned in full. Those had not been ordinary cargo inspectors. They had been searching for someone. Marcus continued quietly. Most of the travelers stepped away from them quickly, but you stayed where you were because you were still trying to understand what they were doing. Serafina's gaze fixed on him, and that was when the lead inspector stopped in front of her. Marcus nodded once. And that was the moment I realized the person they were searching for was standing right beside the observation rail. The throne chamber felt colder as the memory settled fully into place, and Queen Serafina Kale no longer looked at Marcus Cole as a stranger kneeling before her court. Instead, she looked at him the way someone studies a half-forgotten photograph that suddenly becomes clear. The corridor of Horizon Gate returned to her mind with perfect detail. The dim emergency lighting along the outer ring. The steady glow of freighter engines drifting past the station windows. The cargo inspectors wearing orange utility jackets who had moved through the corridor with scanners held at chest level. At the time she had assumed they were verifying shipments delayed by the traffic alarm. But Marcus was right. Their scanners had not been directed at cargo containers. They had been pointed at the travelers standing along the observation rail. Serafina slowly exhaled as the realization unfolded again in her thoughts. Those scanners had been configured to identify biological signatures. Someone on that station had been searching for a specific individual. The royal court remained silent as Marcus continued speaking, his voice calm but precise, as if he had replayed the moment many times in his mind over the years. The lead inspector stopped directly in front of you, he said. At first he pretended to check the cargo manifest screen beside the window, but the scanner in his hand was already reading your identity signature. Serafina remembered the moment clearly now. The device had emitted a faint pulse of blue light as it scanned the corridor. She had not understood the significance until the inspector's expression changed. He had looked surprised. Marcus nodded slightly as he watched the memory return across her face. When the scanner confirmed your identity profile, the entire inspection team suddenly became very interested in the quiet traveler studying shipping routes. The Queen's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. Even under her disguise, certain elements of her biological profile could have revealed her noble lineage to advanced scanners. It had been an oversight on her part, one she had not realized until the situation unfolded. The inspectors had exchanged quick glances before activating their communicators. At the time she had believed they were simply reporting an irregular scan. Now she understood they had recognized something far more significant. Marcus continued quietly. Most people in that corridor were too focused on the docking delay to notice what the inspectors were doing. But I saw the scanner reading change color. It meant the system had detected someone important. Serafina looked directly at him. And you understood what that meant. Marcus gave a small nod. I did not know you were royalty yet. But I knew the inspection team suddenly realized they had found someone valuable. The court shifted slightly at the implication. Valuable was not a word used lightly in frontier space. It often meant leverage. Serafina remembered the uneasy feeling that had settled over the corridor as the inspectors moved closer around her position near the observation rail. They had begun asking quiet questions about her travel documentation. Marcus's voice remained steady as he continued the story. That was when I noticed something else. Two of the inspectors were not watching the station traffic at all. They were watching the exits. Serafina felt a faint chill of recognition move through her. The corridor had indeed been narrowing around her position as more of the inspection team entered the outer ring. She had realized too late that their attention was focused entirely on her. Marcus leaned forward slightly, the chains at his wrists giving a soft metallic sound against the marble floor. They were not cargo inspectors, he said calmly. They were bounty brokers working under a trade authority license. And once their scanners confirmed your identity profile, they believed they had just found the most valuable traveler in the entire station. The quiet statement lingered in the throne chamber like the final note of a distant signal, and Queen Seraphina Kale felt the full weight of the memory settle into place. Bounty brokers. Not inspectors. Not technicians verifying cargo. Hunters searching for leverage in the crowded chaos of a frontier station. 5 years earlier, she had not immediately understood the danger. Horizon Gate had seemed noisy and ordinary that evening, filled with travelers impatiently waiting for docking traffic to resume. But the men with the scanners had been watching her carefully, and the moment their device confirmed her biological signature, the entire tone of their presence had shifted. The lead broker had smiled politely and asked to verify her travel credentials. Seraphina remembered answering calmly, still believing the situation was routine. Her disguise had been carefully prepared. Her escort was nearby, though hidden among the station traffic. Yet the scanners those brokers carried had revealed something she could not conceal completely. The faint genetic markers that identified members of the imperial bloodline. In the throne chamber, Marcus watched the queen closely as she relived the moment. I saw the expression on the lead broker's face when the scanner finished its reading, he said quietly. It was the same look traders get when they discover a cargo crate worth more than their entire ship. A faint murmur moved through the nobles gathered around the chamber walls. Even among the powerful families of the empire, the idea of bounty brokers targeting a royal heir was unsettling. Seraphina continued staring at Marcus, the distant lights of the star dome reflecting in her eyes. At the time she had sensed something was wrong, but had not yet realized the scale of it. The brokers had begun asking more questions. Where she was traveling, who her associates were, why her identification code matched restricted imperial records. Marcus's voice remained steady as he continued the story. You tried to step away from them without drawing attention, but 2 of the brokers had already moved to block the corridor exits. The queen remembered the moment clearly now. The outer docking ring had felt suddenly smaller as the inspection team closed their formation around her position near the observation rail. Travelers nearby had been too distracted by the docking delay to notice the shift. Yet Marcus had noticed. In the throne chamber, he gave a small nod. That was when I realized you were in trouble. Seraphina raised one brow slightly. You were certain of that so quickly. Marcus shrugged faintly. On frontier stations, people learn to recognize when a conversation is not really a conversation. Those brokers were not asking questions because they wanted answers. They were stalling while they confirmed your identity through their network. The court remained silent as the implications settled across the hall. If the brokers had succeeded in identifying the young imperial heir beyond doubt, the situation could have become a diplomatic crisis across half the trade corridor. Seraphina remembered feeling the same realization begin to form as the scanner devices emitted another faint pulse of light. She had turned slightly toward the viewing window, calculating how quickly she could reach the main transit corridor where her escort might intercept the brokers before the situation escalated. Marcus's faint smile returned as he watched the recognition in her expression. But you did not get the chance to leave the corridor, he said calmly. Because that was the moment I decided to interrupt their little conversation. Marcus watched the queen carefully as the memory continued to unfold between them, and for the first time since entering the throne chamber, the faint amusement in his expression softened into something more serious. 5 years earlier, the corridor of Horizon Gate had felt narrow and tense as the bounty brokers slowly closed the distance around the traveler they believed they had identified. The lead broker had kept his tone polite, asking questions about travel permits and destination codes, but the scanner in his hand had already begun transmitting confirmation signals to whatever network had hired them. Seraphina remembered the moment clearly now. She had realized that if the brokers confirmed her identity beyond doubt, they would not allow her to leave the station quietly. Even if they did not intend immediate confrontation, they would report her location to others who might try to claim the reward themselves. On a frontier station crowded with opportunists, that knowledge alone could cause chaos. In the throne chamber, Marcus continued speaking, his voice calm but deliberate. When I saw the scanner change color the second time, I knew they had nearly finished verifying your identity profile. They were only waiting for confirmation from their network before making their move. Seraphina's gaze remained fixed on him. And that is when you interrupted them. Marcus nodded once. The outer ring corridor was not very wide, he said. There were cargo containers stacked along the bulkhead, and only 2 access doors leading back toward the main station traffic. That meant the brokers had to stand close together to keep you surrounded. The court listened in complete silence as the human continued the story. Marcus shifted slightly on his knees, the chains at his wrists giving a soft metallic sound. I walked straight into the middle of their formation and pretended to study the docking schedule display beside the observation rail. At first they ignored me. Most travelers on a station like Horizon Gate keep their distance from inspection teams. But then I said something that forced them to pay attention. Serafina felt a faint spark of recognition. The human voice beside her that evening had spoken suddenly, casually, as if commenting on the docking delay rather than the tension building in the corridor. Marcus smiled faintly as he remembered the moment. I looked at the scanner in the lead broker's hand and told him that if he kept pointing that device at travelers instead of cargo containers, the station authority might think he was running a private identification sweep without a permit. A few quiet murmurs moved through the court as the nobles imagined the scene. Marcus continued calmly. That kind of accusation is a serious problem on a trade station. If the port authority believes someone is running unauthorized scans on passengers, they will shut down the entire docking ring until the situation is investigated. Serafina remembered the subtle change in the broker's expression when the human had spoken. The man had glanced toward the station security cameras mounted along the corridor ceiling. Marcus nodded again. He realized immediately that drawing attention from station security would ruin whatever quiet operation they were trying to run. So instead of focusing on you, he turned his attention toward the loud human traveler standing beside the observation rail. The Queen allowed the faintest hint of a smile. And you gave them someone else to deal with. Marcus shrugged slightly. Frontier stations run on 2 simple rules. Do not cause trouble in front of the cameras, and do not let the port authority think you are hiding something. I simply reminded them of both rules at the same time. Serafina looked at him thoughtfully as the final detail of the memory returned. The brokers had backed away from her position, suddenly busy explaining their presence to the curious human who refused to lower his voice. Marcus met her gaze again, calm as ever. And while they were distracted arguing with me about station regulations, you had just enough time to walk calmly toward the main transit corridor. The memory continued to unfold across the throne chamber like a quiet story that both of them already knew the ending to. And Queen Serafina Kale felt the final moments of that night on Horizon Gate returning with startling clarity. The outer docking corridor had been filled with the low hum of station machinery and the distant rumble of cargo thrusters drifting past the observation windows. While the bounty brokers argued with the human traveler who refused to lower his voice about station scanning regulations, she had slowly stepped away from the observation rail exactly as Marcus described. She remembered the careful pace of those steps, calm and deliberate, as if she were simply another passenger leaving the corridor after losing interest in the docking delay. At the time she had not looked back. Drawing attention would have been a mistake. Instead, she had moved toward the transit corridor that led deeper into the station where her hidden escort would be waiting. In the throne chamber, Marcus watched her expression and gave a small nod, confirming the memory without needing to ask. You reached the transit elevators without anyone stopping you, he said quietly. The Queen folded her arms loosely as she studied him. That part one remember. Marcus's faint smile returned. Most of the brokers were still busy arguing with me about station authority permits and passenger privacy codes. They were too distracted to notice that the traveler they were really interested in had already left the corridor. A few nobles exchanged quiet looks at the clever simplicity of the tactic. Marcus continued calmly. After you disappeared into the transit system, the lead broker finally realized what had happened. But by then the station traffic alarm had ended and dozens of travelers were moving through the docking ring again. Tracking one person through that crowd would have taken too long. Serafina nodded slowly. Her escort had intercepted her in the next corridor and escorted her directly back to her ship without further incident. At the time, she had believed the moment was simply another strange event during a long diplomatic journey. She had never learned what happened to the human who had distracted the brokers long enough for her to leave safely. Until now. The court remained silent as Marcus finished the story. When the brokers realized you were gone, they were not very happy, he admitted with quiet amusement. They spent several minutes explaining to station security why they had been conducting identity scans in a passenger corridor without filing the proper permits. That conversation did not go very well for them. Serafina allowed the faintest smile to appear. I imagine it did not. Marcus shrugged slightly. Frontier stations take their traffic regulations very seriously. By the time the brokers finished answering questions from the Port Authority, their window of opportunity had already closed. The Queen looked at him thoughtfully, the glow of the star-filled dome reflecting across the chamber floor between them. For 5 years, she had not known the identity of the traveler who had created that distraction. The Empire had grown, her father had passed the throne to her, and countless other events had filled the years since that night. Yet the quiet decision made by a human traveler on a distant frontier station had quietly shaped the path that followed. She spoke softly now, her voice carrying across the silent chamber. You never asked who I was that night. Marcus met her gaze with the same calm certainty he had shown since entering the hall. I did not need to know your name, he replied. I only knew that the people surrounding you were not interested in a friendly conversation. Serafina tilted her head slightly, curiosity returning to her expression. And after all those years, after traveling across half the trade corridor to reach this palace, you still never asked for a reward. Marcus's faint smile returned once more. No, Your Majesty, because that was not why I helped you. The throne chamber remained silent long after Marcus finished speaking, and the quiet felt different now. The tension that had filled the hall when he first arrived had softened into something far more unusual for an imperial court. Curiosity, respect, perhaps even a quiet sense of disbelief. Queen Serafina Kale studied the human kneeling before her, the faint starlight from the great glass dome above reflecting across the old scars on his arms and shoulders. 5 years earlier, he had been just another traveler on a frontier station, a man with a cargo job and a loud voice who had stepped into a dangerous conversation simply because something felt wrong. At the time, she had not known his name. She had not known his story. She had only known that a stranger had chosen to stand between her and a situation that could have changed the course of her life. Now that stranger had crossed half the known trade corridor just to stand in front of her again. Slowly the Queen stepped closer, her boots echoing softly across the polished marble floor until she stood only a few feet from him. The nobles and officers lining the chamber walls watched carefully, aware that they were witnessing a moment none of them had expected when the human prisoner was first brought into the hall. Serafina's voice carried calmly across the chamber. If you did not come for a reward, she said, then you must have had another reason to travel this far. Marcus lifted his eyes toward her again, calm as ever. I did. The Queen waited. Marcus exhaled slowly, as if considering how best to explain something that had been simple in his mind for years. 5 years ago, I saw someone who was trying to understand how the frontier really worked, he said. Not someone hiding behind titles or escorts. Just a traveler asking honest questions. Serafina listened without interrupting. Marcus continued quietly. Most people in power never bother to see places like Horizon Gate. They read reports and listen to advisors, but they never stand in the middle of a cargo corridor and watch how the system actually moves. But you did. The Queen felt the faintest warmth behind his words. Not flattery, but recognition. Marcus shrugged slightly. I figured if someone like that ever became important someday, the galaxy might be a little better off. A few quiet murmurs moved through the court at the blunt honesty of the statement. Marcus looked up at the great dome where distant stars drifted slowly across the glass. When news started spreading across the trade networks that the new ruler of the Empire used to travel the frontier in disguise, I realized the traveler from Horizon Gate had become someone very important. Serafina tilted her head slightly. And that is when you decided to come here. Marcus nodded once. I wanted to see if the person I met 5 years ago was still the same person sitting on that throne. The chamber fell silent again as the meaning of his words settled into the air. The Queen studied him for a long moment before finally speaking again. And what is your answer? Marcus met her gaze without hesitation. You still ask the right questions. For the first time since the human entered the chamber, Queen Serafina Kale allowed herself to smile openly. Then she turned toward the guards standing nearby. Remove his restraints, she said calmly. The guards hesitated only for a moment before stepping forward to unlock the chains around Marcus's wrists. The soft metallic sound echoed gently across the hall as the restraints fell away. Serafina looked back at him once more. 5 years ago, she said quietly, you gave me the chance to walk away from a dangerous situation without asking for anything in return. She paused briefly before continuing. Today I will return that favor in a different way. The queen extended one hand toward him. Stand up, Marcus Cole. The empire could use more travelers who are willing to speak honestly to a throne.